Hello, welcome to our second lecture on food security. And today we're going to be talking about labor-intensive agriculture and the role that labor-intensive agriculture can play in boosting our current and future food security. So let me define what labor-intensive agriculture is. So it's clearly producing more food with more labor. Should have integrated that into the slide, but that's kind of common sense. But it's not a way of doing it by making people poorer, by just packing people into the land. There's a concept in economics called marginal return on labor. So for labor-intensive agriculture to work, as you add people, they have to be producing more pie. Think about it as if they were producing what they were going to eat. If you add another individual, the marginal return on labor should be growing or equal. If you get to a point that you keep adding people, and that means that there's less to go around, then you've got something what anthropologists call agricultural involution. And that's a population issue. Then the system is not working that well. It's not working the way, in an ideal way. It's going to force migration, force issues like happened in Rwanda, where farms became too small, were unable to support the family sizes that existed, and it was a major spark in the Civil War. So at some level, you can't continue to just add people and expect food production to go up, but clever labor-intensive agriculture can absorb a lot of labor. And it does this by mimicking the complexity of natural ecosystems, and we'll look at some examples. There's a subfield in agronomy called agroecology, which is basically what this is all about. It's trying to figure out how to mimic the complexity of a natural ecosystem to be able to extract more energy from it. Along with that is finding novel ways to capture more of the sun's radiation falling on a given batch of land. So that's important too. That's all part of agroecology. So traditionally, we haven't done very much about labor-intensive agriculture. It's been considered backwards. You know, the image of people working with hand tools versus machine tractors and working with things like inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. There's been a stigma against it, but even more significant is that in low-income countries, there's generally been a stigma against agriculture. Economic development theory told low-income countries not to worry about agriculture because it's a backward segment of their economy. So a lot of the technology that trickled into low-income countries was coming from high-income countries where there's also a bias against labor-intensive agriculture, and we'll talk about that. So historically, there have been very few lower and mid-income countries that have invested a lot in agriculture. Two notable exceptions are Vietnam and Ghana, and we'll be talking a fair amount about Vietnam during this lecture. Also, in high-income countries, most government research dollars have gone to match the interests of big business and capital-intensive farming, rather than to enhance the ability of small farmers to increase their productivity and livelihood. So again, we talked about agency capture, beginning of the semester, the elite model. Generally, what's been researched in American universities especially has corresponded tightly to the interests of big players in this space, who have the muscle to push federal research dollars, and their interests have often been more short-term and boosting their own profitability. So things like agroecology have not gotten a lot of funding. So I want to give you an example of what labor-intensive agriculture is. And I want to start with discussion of the granddaddy of them all, wet rice. The slides I'm about to show I've taken during a trip to Vietnam in 2008. And we'll be talking a fair amount about Vietnam in this lecture. The main reason, well, I'll leave that for just a little later, but Vietnam is a great example of what can be done if you invest in small farmers and are more open-minded and acknowledge that small farmers, given good ideas and innovation, can boost food production. So wet rice. Wet rice is the granddaddy of all labor-intensive agriculture systems. And I mentioned about ecosystem mimicry. What wet rice is doing is it's mimicking the attributes of a wetland. You plant the rice when the field is dry and then you flood it. And when you flood it, it basically looks like a wetland, a grassland growing underwater. Now, to consider how this works from a labor perspective, I mean, let's think of it crudely. Let's say I have a patch of land and I'm a bachelor farmer. I have to spend most of my labor on the hydrology part of my farm, making sure that the canals are clear, that I have water flowing through my farm, and then I owe an obligation to my neighbor to make sure that the water flows onto their farm. This aspect, the hydrology part of wet farming, requires a lot of labor. So in terms of what I can grow on the field, I'm limited because I'm putting most of my labor into managing the flow of water through my field. However, let's say I get married and now I have a wife. My wife can help by planting the rice, growing it in a nursery and planting it, because when I was farming on my own, I didn't have the time. All I could do was throw seeds around, and some places they grew clumpy, some places they didn't grow. But now by having another person working, the rice can be planted out in the field after it comes from the nursery in a uniform distribution, so we maximize what's growing on the field. So now we have a field with rice growing, but there's a lot more we can do. I mentioned that this is a wetland, so think about what goes in a wetland. We can have fish, we can have crustaceans like crawdads, we can have frogs that we eat, we can have waterfowl that are eating the algae growing on the water. By adding complexity, we're getting more energy out of that given unit of land. One of the most interesting stories I've heard was from a former Peace Corps volunteer all the way back in the 60s who was working in northern Thailand. She was working with some very innovative farmers, and one of them was really frustrated because he recognized that rats were getting a good portion of his seed, of his rice, and was trying to figure out what to do about that. So if you'll notice along the fields, there are edges, there's often higher elevated parts where people walk on. And in these areas that are not underwater, he put in kind of these concrete boxes with holes up to the surface and got some small pythons. And the pythons didn't get rid of all the rats, but kept their population low. And he would occasionally harvest pythons, eat the meat, and skin the snake. And back in the 60s, snake skin was really in for shoes and boots and belts, and make additional money that way. So again, that's the kind of thinking that's needed if you're going to be successful as a labor-intensive farmer. So I've talked about the ecosystem a little bit. You can see this is a collective rice farm in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam. You have water flowing through the fields. You have larger irrigation ditches around the area. Part of this farm and any farm, usually that's doing labor-intensive wet rice, is waterfowl. Again, waterfowl feeding on mostly the algae that's growing on the field, so they're using a resource that otherwise would have been wasted, but now the farmer has an additional source of food, additional source of income in the waterfowl. All right. I've been talking a lot about Vietnam. you can see where Vietnam is. Vietnam is it's a very densely populated country of about 80 million people. It is a country that is rapidly changing from being rural to urban. It is about, when I went there, it was about 71% rural back in 2008. Today, that number's decreased by almost 10%. But the reason I'm giving you this information is that you can see there's not a whole lot of cities in Vietnam, especially big ones. And what the government was afraid of in Vietnam more than 20 years ago, actually 30 years ago, was young people just picking up and moving to the cities where there are no jobs, where they would overwhelm infrastructure. And so Vietnam did something very novel, something that few other countries have done. I mentioned Ghana as another exception. They decided to invest in agriculture, especially smallholder agriculture. And their universities have been working with small farmers very intensively to develop new ideas, new ways of farmers on small pieces of land growing more food and increasing their incomes. So what I want to look at now is what's been going on in the Mekong Delta outside of rice farming. So as I mentioned here, some statistics about Vietnam. It's a 64% rural still today in 2020. In 2008, when I was there, it was 71% rural. And again, this is very novel in that it goes against traditional economic development theory, which says spend your money on cities. Cities are the engines of economic development. Few countries like Vietnam and Ghana have stood that logic on their head and have shown that you can also do economic development by investing in rural populations. So here's the Mekong Delta. As you can see, it's very low-lying. A lot of it is flooded either all the year or part of the year, so this presents a unique challenge to farming. On top of that, the soil also has a lot of sulfur content. The good news is that the Mekong Delta, which starts all the way up in China, up in the mountains, carries enormous amount of silt with it, so that is a positive attribute for farming. If you can accumulate the silt and avoid the soil, that original soil that's rich in sulfur, that's not good for most plants. It's a challenge to farming here, and because of this challenge, even though this is a very densely populated area of the world, people didn't really settle here in large numbers until the 19th century. So, a few more facts about the Mekong Delta. It's one of the major growing rice regions in the world. You can get up to 3 crops a year in the Mekong Delta. In northern Vietnam, which is more seasonal, you can only get 1 rice crop a year. Approximately 16 million people live there. Again, these are people who are living in close proximity to water because it's hard to live somewhere that doesn't flood, at least sometimes. Most areas you just assume are going to flood frequently. In this region, when I visited in 2008, there were basically 2 types of farms. The large collective farms, which specialized in growing rice, and the small farms, generally under 2 acres, where fruit and fish are produced. The produce of the small farms is generally sold in the floating markets that dot the region. So here's an example of a floating market. You can see the big ships. These bigger ships have gone around and they have bought the produce from farmers. If you look at the things that are sticking up on the ships that look like flagpoles, these tell you what they're selling. But they go around in this area that's full of rivers and canals. So again, if you look at a map of Vietnam, the Mekong Delta, which is pretty straight, stays in one channel for most of its pathway. When it gets into Vietnam, it immediately breaks into 2 channels, continues to separate from there. So this is an area dotted with river channels and canals, and so aquatic transportation is the best way to get around. Here you can see Again, Mekong Delta, a really cool place to go to see these traditional floating markets. If you see them elsewhere in Asia, they're usually catered towards tourism, like in Thailand. But here, this is a real functioning floating market. This is near Kan Tao in the Mekong Delta. And again, you can see these ships. They clearly advertise what they're selling. Also interesting attribute in the Mekong Delta, this is the traditional way of getting around. You row while standing up. You can see this is a ship that has quite a lot of large variety of produce for sale. Again, all these come from small farmers, usually most of them farming on less than 2 acres. So I'm going to take you to some of these farms now. This is a farm that, again, it's less than 2 acres, that's producing fruit and fish. And here you can see some of the fruit that's in season right now in their farm. And what's really cool about these farms is that these are flooded forests. This is a type of ecosystem. Many parts of the world where you have river systems like the Mekong River or the Amazon, you have forests that for part of the year are flooded. These forests are not quite flooded in that they've found a way to keep the roots of the trees above water, but basically it is a wetland that they are growing fruit crops on. These are mangosteens, a highly prized fruit in Southeast Asia. One quick note is that in many parts of the world, people don't have access to good, clean piped water. Even though they have water all around them, the water is highly contaminated with fecal matter, so you survive by harvesting rainwater. And this is true in a broad range of environments around the world. So this probably looks like no farm you've ever seen before. The trees are growing on raised mounds. Between them is water, and in the water, the farmer is producing fish. I've put this picture in here on purpose. You can see the bottle. In the bottle, you have a pheromone and a sticky solution. This is a type of integrated pest management. So because the people are farming and living in the water, you don't want to throw a bunch of chemicals in here. So the government of Vietnam has contributed money to developing tools for integrated pest management. This is using a tool called a pheromone. Pheromones are chemical compounds that mimic the chemicals that female insects emit to attract males. And what they're doing here is they're attracting males basically to their doom. They're following the pheromone, and then they end up in this sticky trap. This is something that could be done on a more wide-scale nature around the world, but it takes a lot of work, it's expensive to do, and again, when research agendas are tilted towards big-scale ag, this kind of research doesn't get done. But in Vietnam, it's getting done because of their commitment to small-scale agriculture. Banana trees. I was here in 2008 with a group of faculty from around different US universities vetting program by SIT, the School for International Training. They have a program in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, and they took us around to some of the places that their students spend time to during the semester. All right, I mentioned complexity. How do you make your system more complex? So this is a forest that's surrounded by water, and you could just have trees, or you could think about adding complexity. What you're looking at here is a vine, and it's where we get black pepper from. A lot of our spices are vines. Vanilla is another good example. And by adding vines, you're adding complexity, and you're not only adding food products. We'll look at an example of a food product, which is dragon fruit, which is a cactus that grows like a vine. Next, coming slide. But this also gives you a good source of income. The farmer is not only trying to increase food for self-consumption, but trying to grow things that will allow the farmer to increase his or her income. This is dragon fruit, very prized fruit in Asia. You can see how it grows. It's a cactus growing in a vine-like form. Again, this is adding complexity to the system. You can think about just planting your trees, or you could think about how you can get more out of your forest. Again, like no other farm you've seen, of course, your farm's not too big. It goes, the water flows between you and your neighbor. So if you want to keep your fish on your farm, you have to find ways to block the movement of fish. And no space is wasted. If you see what's growing on the fence here, this is a vine in the passion fruit family. Very good for eating and especially for making juices. Now, I mentioned a lot of silt comes down through the Mekong Delta, but big problem is you don't want to just go deep into the mud because that's very rich in sulfur and plants don't grow well in that kind of soil. So each year farmers generally kind of harvest some of the silt, some also the decaying organic matter, the leaves that have fallen in and mulched, and build up their piles, their mounds. Here you see two young papaya trees that have been planted in soil that's been recently excavated up. Just giving you a range of the different fruit that's growing on a typical farm like this. Right now I want to present you with a neat innovation to what we just looked at, the fish and fruit farm. Now, this innovation is adding pigs. And some of you might wonder why waste space raising pigs. Well, they're taking space that they would have had to use to grow trees for firewood. And they're taking that space now and they're using it for pigs. And the pigs are doing several things for them. They're actually providing energy. We'll look at how pigs are providing energy. They're providing a food source. And they're also, the pig poo is providing fertilizer, helping more algae grow in the water, which their fish, which are mostly herbivorous. Most farmers grow herbivorous fish, but some we'll look at have also growing more carnivorous fish like snakefish, but mostly it's fish that eat algae. So here's a farm that has pigs. They have a few sows, a boar, piglets. They get cheap waste from the rice, the husk, to feed the pigs. Again, the government has a good distribution process so that they get waste product is turned into food. Boar, sows. Now, typical on these farms, you'll see these big plastic sacks. They're storing the methane that's coming from the pig waste. So while we were there just as a demonstration project, we, being the faculty from the US, we chipped in about $80 so that we could do this on a farm. The $80 didn't cover the brick pens, it was built already, but covered the rest of it, the plastic bags that were used, the piping to run the waste from where the pigs are into the water. And here you can see this is where the methane is being stored. So here you can see the water is rather green. It's a lot of pig manure is going in there, human waste feeds the algae, and you can see the fish in the water. These are mostly tilapia, which are being raised for self-consumption. You can see the pipe, dumping water. Also, this is typical in the region. This is what people have in place of toilets with running water. This is called a hanging toilet. So you can see how easy this was to make. It's like a bunch of giant Glad bags with openings. Several are put inside of each other just in case one breaks. The system doesn't fail. Then you tie this around a pipe on each end, secure it, bury it, and then you've got clean gas to cook with. And this is great on many levels. It burns clean, means you don't have to grow trees for firewood. And from a public health perspective, this is really good because burning wood indoors is really strong irritant for your lungs. It's can really cause disease and decrease your life expectancy. Methane burns really clean, so people who are working in the kitchen don't suffer from respiratory problems, as if they were in the old days when they were burning wood, respiratory problems would be a big problem. You can see it's a very clean kitchen because it's not burning wood. And here on one of the farms, an excellent meal was prepared for us using things from the farm with the exception of the water. One of the things that I was really impressed with when I was in Vietnam, in 2008, the per capita income in Vietnam was $800. It's very low. In rural areas, it was only $400. And I had traveled in a lot of places where rural incomes were even much higher. But what I saw in rural Vietnam was a standard of living much higher than their per capita income would suggest. They were well fed. There was no problem of food insecurity. Their children had access to very good education. I was really impressed with what I saw in the Mekong Delta and other rural areas of Vietnam. You can see this is a typical roadway because there's so much water here. You don't have large transportation roadways. Water is the main way to get around. Some of the schools mentioned this is how people row. I put this picture in here just to show you what happens when you don't have the pigs. You have to spend a lot of land on producing wood just to cook with, and you also have to spend a lot of time collecting and drying that wood so it's ready to cook with. So the pigs are actually a big advance. Not only are you getting energy out of it, but you're getting food. You can sell the pigs also for income. This is one other area I mentioned. You have to think strategically as a small farmer. You have to try to diversify your income, find different ways to produce money. So I mentioned vines before for spices. Also, a lot of vines are used in medicinal, traditional medicines. Traditional medicine market I found when I was traveling around a lot about a decade ago in lower income countries was booming. In places from Latin America to Southeast Asia to Siberia, people were turning back towards herbal medicine. And one of the reasons for that is medicines produced by pharmaceutical companies are generally financially out of reach of most people. In the past, people could buy low doses out of prescription. But what's happened in the past 15, 20 years are counterfeit drugs have flooded into this space. And it means that you could be buying something that basically has a nice looking box and it looks like it's from Pfizer, but the ingredients are inert ingredients and it does no good for you. So unless you can afford to go to the expensive pharmacy, in many countries now, people are turning back towards herbal medicine as being something more reliable than potential of getting counterfeit drugs. It's an herbal, traditional medicinal place in Vietnam. You can find traditional medicinal places all over the world, especially Asia. Fruit market in Can Tho. This is again fruit that has come from these small farms. This is an area of research. I mentioned that Vietnam has directed its universities to apply a lot of research towards smallholder agriculture. A lot of what they're looking at are things that can be done in the water, trying to find higher value animals that can be raised in the water rather than just tilapia. So crustaceans have been getting a lot of attention. And I want to highlight what this is. These are larval snakefish, young snakefish. Snakefish are a huge problem in the US when people have them in their fish tanks and throw them into ponds because they can breathe air, so they can move from one body of water to the next. And they're high-level predators, so it's a big concern that they could at some point get into a river in the US. But in Southeast Asia, they're a delicacy. They were really hard. It took a long time to figure out how to reproduce them in captivity. It was actually a small farmer with limited education who figured out how to do it. And so now some farmers are raising snakefish because there's a very lucrative market for it, and it's a good way to make money. What do you feed snakefish? Partly, I know that some of, at least, farmers raising carnivorous fish have access to fish meal, which is produced in Vietnam from bycatch. In many places, bycatch is just thrown back in the water dead. All right, I want to look at some other examples of labor-intensive agriculture. In many bays, you find houses in the middle of nowhere surrounded by water, and they're raising things like oysters, cockerels. Could be here, there's not fish, but we'll look later on at a place where they're doing aquaculture with fish. I want to just highlight this story as another really cool example of labor-intensive agriculture. This is a mangrove that's between the sea and Ho Chi Minh City, which used to be Saigon. During the war, the Viet Cong would use the forest to hide in. And one of the tactics of the US Army during the Vietnam War was to kill the forest with a powerful herbicide called Agent Orange, a defoliant. That's had a lot of impacts in terms on human health. It's a powerful carcinogen and mutagen, so lots of cancers and birth defects have resulted on both sides. After the war, the path between the sea and Ho Chi Minh City was pretty clear. There wasn't much in the way of forest protecting it from tropical cyclones. So Vietnam embarked on one of the largest reforestation projects out of necessity to protect one of the most important cities from tropical storms. As the mangroves grew back, people started moving in and illegally chopping the wood, either to sell the wood or to create charcoal. And around the world, anti-poaching efforts, whether it's been to protect against illegal timber harvesting or killing of animals, is usually not successful because salaries are so low. And when you go in and you pay people as anti-poachers, it's usually in their interest not to risk their life and to work with the poachers and get a payoff. Vietnam figured out a clever way how to reward its rangers. They are paid a salary as a ranger, which is pretty good compared to what was being paid in Vietnam at the time, but they're also allowed to use the land to make money in a sustainable way. And this is where they make a good income. These people are stationed around in these mangroves, like this farmer who we're going to see what he's doing. And where he's making most of his money is by extensively farming shrimp. So I visited this farm with some Vietnamese professors, and their salary, this was back in 2008, they were making about $2,000 a year. This particular farmer was making $8,000 plus a year. The faculty were quite jealous. They had studied in places like the US and France, gotten their PhDs there, and they were making a quarter of what this ranger slash farmer is making. So the shrimp live here in the mangroves, and when there's a full moon, they move out into deeper water to reproduce. This offers a really good chance then to harvest some of the shrimp. So there are these little places where you know the shrimp are going to go through. When the moon is full, you set out your nets. Very simple strategy. This is the inside of that farm. The farmer is the person in the more yellowish golden. He's talking, and the professor is with the green shirt. Another professor with a white shirt. So again, this is a form of farming, but it's also a form of anti-poaching. So Vietnam, again, very innovative strategy. I was, again, impressed with how Vietnam, without a lot of money and resources, often uses innovation to solve a lot of its problems. All right, I want to introduce you now to a national park in northern Vietnam, Ha Long Bay, a famous tourism place. It's different than American national parks, though. Here, people haven't been removed. There are these little villages practicing aquaculture throughout the park. And frankly, having these people living in the national park, producing food, made the experience more interesting for me. It's a beautiful place, but at the same time, I enjoyed seeing what these people were doing in these small little communities. You can see the nets all around. So it's a beautiful place to visit. And you can see here, not only were they growing oysters, there was really cheap pearls to be bought here, but also these are where they're raising fish. In these pens, they have a variety of different fish that they're raising. Here's just a sunset picture of the national park. Very different approach than in the US, where we believe people should be pushed out of national parks. Right. What we were looking at when we were looking at the fruit and fish, or fruit, fish, and pig, the use of trees in agriculture is called agroforestry. I want to give you a few other examples from other parts of the world and looking at how agroforestry is used. I want to jump now from Vietnam to Southwest Kenya. And I want to thank Amy Cook for most of these pictures. Dr. Amy Cook was a Peace Corps volunteer here in the 1990s. And you'll see a young Dr. Cook in one of these slides. Southwest Kenya is very dry. It's also very hilly. This presents some huge challenges for agriculture. When you're trying to grow crops on hills, gravity takes water downwards, so you're already in an area with very little water. So when it does rain, you're losing most of your water quickly. You also have to deal with wind. So this is an area that's right on the equator, intense sun, and then wind can also further desiccate the soils. So one of the things that not only the Peace Corps, but the UN Food and Agricultural Organization has in Kenya, an Institute for Agroforestry. In this area, they developed a new way of growing crops. It's a form of terracing like you see with rice. You can see these are like terraces, but there are these areas that are deeper which catch water. And in these water catchments, or right around them, trees are planted. We'll talk more about what the trees are good for. Here's just a typical village in this region. Picture with Dr. Cook in the village. You can see the trees growing in these places with water. Sometimes it's drier. You can see the hills. Getting back to this picture, what do the trees do? The trees are helping to block the wind, so they're decreasing desiccation. If you think about wind, it's a powerful way to desiccate. People who don't have clothes dryers, if you hang your clothes on a line, you know when it's windy, the clothes dry really quickly. They're also, by digging the terraces like this to contain water, stopping gravity from allowing the water to run downhill. And it's the water's being released more slowly so it can irrigate your crops. Right now, this area is barren, but certainly at some time, corn or other crops will be planted around the trees. The leaves of the trees also add carbon to the soil, so as they fall down, helps enrich the soil with carbon, making it spongier so it can hold and absorb water better. The shade of the trees also blocking some of the intense heat. It's probably worth the price having shade for a few hours a day in terms of lost solar radiation, but protecting against excessive desiccation. Now, the trees are helping to diversify diets, income. It's not only fruit trees that can be planted, you can plant things that you can use in your home for wood, for either construction or firewood. You can also harvest branches to feed goats. There's a lot of different things you can do with the wood to improve your life. Studies on what was done in Southwest Kenya showed that this technique really helped boost food production and also helped boost income for families. So this is a very typical kind of innovation for labor-intensive agriculture. And my argument is that it can play an important role in helping to feed the world. While what happens on big farms is important, we have to remember there are hundreds of millions of small farmers around the world, and we have to come up with technologies and innovations that will help them improve their lives and also produce more food. A few other examples. This is alley cropping. This is where it's flatter and you can see you're growing crops between trees. All of the advantages I mentioned for Southwest Kenya, this is more Eastern Kenya, still apply. You're creating a bit of shade. You're getting the benefit of the leaves going into the soil. The trees are also helping to block the wind. So you're getting all of the advantages that I cited before also by doing alley cropping on flat land. A few other examples of agroforestry. Iguana farming. Back when I was a student traveling around the world in the 1990s in Latin America, iguana farming was all the rage. Haven't heard that much about it lately. Maybe it didn't turn out to be as good as people hoped for, but there's still some farmers out there who are raising iguanas in forests. Non-traditional animals could also be raised on farms that are much more sustainable looking. Things like large rodents like capybaras or paca-agoutis. Capybaras are certainly being ranched, and a lot of people are looking at how you could domestically raise paca-agoutis. Paca-agoutis are not as large as capybaras, but a fairly large rodent. Other really interesting research at one of the UN's agricultural research centers in Turrialba, Costa Rica. I visited there in the 1990s. They were looking at raising goats. The problem with goats in the tropics is that goats can't have their feet wet for long periods of time, or their hooves will rot, the goats will die. So if you're going to raise them in the tropics, you have to keep them in raised pens. So then how did the goats eat? Well, the trick is you can grow a forest around the farm, and this research institute at Turrialba was doing research on what are the best trees to plant to feed goats. And so what the farmer has to do is go around with his shears a few times a day, cut branches, and feed them to the goats. This is a very sustainable form of farming. You've got goats where you get milk, cheese, meat from the goats, but you're also maintaining a forest to feed the goats, which helps preserve biodiversity. And even you think about migration of animals between national parks, having farms with a lot of trees provides much better, much more suitable migratory corridors. I want to switch to the US, and I'm going to wrap up soon because I'm going to have an interview with an organic farmer as part of our unit on agriculture before we wrap up. And I want you to just look at this picture of an organic farm, and what you'll see that's different about an organic farm from most traditional larger farms is the scale. It's smaller. It's also diverse. There's not just one kind of vegetable growing here. There's a wide assortment of different crops that are being grown here. I want to talk about some of the factors that increasingly, and I'm going to use the word organic, but it could also, I'm also talking about local farms. They don't necessarily have to be organic. Some people find it expensive to be certified and might occasionally want to reserve some non-organic tactics to keep production up. But basically, organic farms and local food, there are a lot of favorable winds blowing in that direction at the moment in high-income countries like the US. First of all, consumers are increasingly taking charge. They're tired of just accepting what the market has to offer. A good example is when I was growing up, there were very few varieties of apples in the supermarket. And the typical apple was the red delicious apple. I didn't like apples when I was a kid because they were mushy and they didn't taste like anything. Now I love apples because at some point other types of apples were introduced to consumers, and that's what they started to demand. So the marketplace completely changed. This is happening all over the food space, that consumers are increasingly demanding better quality, better tasting food. Fresh produce, we can guess, is going to continue to be on the rise, and ultra-processed foods will continue to decline. Health and good nutrition will become increasingly powerful drivers in the market. Companies in the food space will be rebranding to show support for healthy living. And healthy food will position itself as the antidote to big pharma and runaway healthcare costs. Earlier in the semester, we talked about how living outcomes are not great in the US. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world that does not yield great results. There are lots of problems with our health delivery system, but a lot of problems are also that we have bad lifestyles, which makes us sick. And part of the solution to an expensive healthcare system is to take better care of ourselves. At least part of that begins with better eating and being more active. I want to give you a few examples. I'm not going to go too far with this because we will be speaking to an organic farmer soon. What are some of the things that organic farmers must do to succeed? You keep your costs down, and you do that by minimizing outside inputs. What you'll see is that it's impossible to farm without outside inputs. You can build up soil fertility over time, but you're going to need some outside inputs to get there, and probably to maintain what you have. We'll hear from our farmer what those inputs are. You have to be really engaged with managing your soil fertility. Organic farmer has to take a long-term perspective. And in addition to maintaining nutrient levels, they have to establish a friendly environment for soil microbes, which are really important for good food production, and doing so in a way that compensate for not using lots of fertilizers, or at least synthetic fertilizers, and also having a good microbial environment can help you keep healthier plants, help fight off disease and pests. You have to strengthen the ecosystem by making it more diverse in order to attract and maintain the natural enemies of many crop pests. You have to create a beef-friendly environment on your farm, so that requires using space to plant flowers, which maybe you might cut some and sell them also, but a lot of You have to give a lot of space to the bees so that the bees can pollinate your plants. It's not like a large farm where you might plant a huge area at the same time under one crop. Let's say you're growing lettuce. You don't plant your whole area that you're going to dedicate to lettuce at one time. You need to keep produce coming in so you have a constant source of income, but also to maintain your relationship with customers. You have to be able to supply them with food, not just a few times a year, but on a regular basis. And then you have to plant a diversity of crops also for ecological reasons, but also to attract and maintain a customer base. Well, we'll look at more of the challenges when we talk to our organic farm. Some of the business considerations for organic farming, these are just a few, we'll learn some more. You need to shorten the supply chain. You gotta cut out the middleman, or you won't, if you have a middleman, at least if you're a small farmer, you're not gonna be able to make enough money. By cutting out the middleman, you can sell for a price that's not too far away from what supermarkets are charging. And this allows you to get in the ballpark of being competitive, at least from a price perspective. You need to develop strong customer relations. This requires time. You need to think about adding value to what you produce. You have extra berries that you can't sell, you need to turn them into jellies and jams. You're raising some animals in order to have more of a good crop rotation. If you're going to try and sell pork to the market, you're going to have a hard time finding slaughterhouses. You're going to have a hard time finding a market for your pork. But if you allow your pigs to graze on acorns and to graze on grass and market your meat as higher value pork because it's you have free-ranging pigs, you can get a higher price for your pigs. And you can also, if you want to go further with that, you can add value by producing smoked meats, charcuterie. And there are some farmers in the Southeast who have begun to do that. Plenty of oak trees, plenty of acorns. I'm aware of a farm in Georgia, one in Virginia. The Biltmore House has higher value pork, but they use it all as meat in their restaurants rather than producing charcuterie. But this is certainly kind of thinking that small farmers need if they're going to compete. They have to add value. Many small farmers increasingly rely on agritourism as part of their business. It's not always feasible. It's a lot more feasible if you've got scenery or some kind of really interesting crop or animal. For example, there's a bison farm north of here in Person County. They do, in addition to raising bison, they host weddings and other types of meetings on the farm. So thinking innovatively about how you can use your land to, again, create another resource, that's very important. Some social actions to support organic farmers. Create farmers markets, put them in strategic places, not alongside highways. Maybe. Put them, as we build denser areas, put them next to where people live. Opportunities for farmers at large park and ride lots. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more park and ride lots pop up. Nobody's thought about large number of people, the same people every day coming to and from work. Why not put a few farmers in there who can sell produce or even cook food already people can take home and eat. Certainly better than going through the drive-through window on the way home. Nobody in the US is really doing that, but something we should be doing. Local communities, local governments organizing fairs, farm tours, and other events that celebrate local agriculture. Finally, something that local governments can do is help establish meat processing operations that are open to independent producers. too many independent producers don't have options. If they're not part of some integer like Smithfield, they have nowhere to go with their meat. Most smaller operations have closed long ago. We're just beginning to tackle this problem and open places now that cater to small independent producers. Right, that's it for now. Those the end of our series of lectures on food security. We will be coming back with a webinar on organic agriculture as part of this unit. Until then, hope you have a great rest of your day.